Hi everyone, it's Nicole here today for Mama Elephant with a rainbow stenciled background and a rainbow stamped large greeting. This greeting is the focal point of the card, and I thought by stamping it in rainbow to kind of mimic the look of the background, it really added a fun effect to this design. We're going to start with the background of this card. I've got some Bristol Smooth cardstock here, and the Simon Says Stamp Zigzag Stencil. And I'm not going to really do any special masking or anything like that, but I am going to kind of pounce the ink on. I found that pouncing it on worked really well, especially kind of just to do the zigzag shape. I want the inks to overlap. That's where we're going to get that beautiful kind of seamless transition. I'm using picked raspberry, spiced marmalade, squeezed lemonade, twisted citron, peacock feathers, and wilted violet. And this is going to give me very much a rainbow effect, and which is definitely what I was going for here, but kind of more of a bright rainbow effect, more pastel than primary colors. Now I'm going to ink up the whole thing, just holding my stencil kind of in place with my finger. You could also tape it if you wanted to on the back. I found this worked fine. I wasn't going so much for perfection. And you can see I'm definitely overlapping. Now when you remove it, there's going to be lots and lots of white space. This would be beautiful. However, I wanted more color on my background. And in order to do this, I am simply going to line up my stencil now with what I've already inked and go over the stencil again using a little bit lighter hand this time for more of an ombre tone-on-tone effect, and ink up those white areas now with the same ink colors. This is going to completely add color to the entire background, and it's going to be super pretty. I love how this turned out. Now these are the Distress Oxide ink colors, meaning they've got pigment ink in them. They're going to stay wet a little bit longer. So before you do this next step, I highly recommend going ahead and heating up your background to set that ink, because we're going to be stamping this large Creativity is Contagious sentiment from the stamp set of the same name. But I'm also going to be finishing this by stamping it with a clear embossing ink over my pigment ink and heat setting that with clear embossing powder. And we don't want the clear embossing powder sticking to any ink that is wet. So I'm heating that background, just making sure it's completely dry. I hit it with a heat tool. You could let it sit for a couple hours. You could let it sit overnight, whatever it might be. Whenever I'm in a hurry, I just hit it with a heat tool. Now, I am leaving this in because I felt it was kind of important. What I originally tried to do is something that worked for me with a large background stamp that I did for Simon Says Stamp, and that was using my ink blending tools to kind of blend the inks together. I did use the ink pad itself first and then blend it, and it worked really well. And I thought, well, I want to see if it will work for the sentiment. It doesn't. You're going to see that here in a minute. It's just not enough ink. You really need to use the ink pad. So I've left it in because I wanted to show you, and it's so light that most of it gets lost. So I'm going to go back now with my actual ink pads, and I'm just kind of very messily applying the ink in rainbow color to my stamp. The color I did originally use quite a bit of the squeezed lemonade. It is not going to show up over the squeezed lemonade background. The great thing about this technique is you can keep applying ink until you get it to look the way you want. So you can see the word contagious does not show up at all, nor does the word is really. So I am going to go back, and because I'm using the Misty, I can stamp it in the same place over and over again. We're going to add more of the spiced marmalade, more of the twisted citron, until we get the colors dark enough that the sentiment is easy to read. And I felt like it was important to leave this in so that if you're working on a card and maybe your initial idea doesn't turn out, just to kind of give you an idea of my process of trying to overcome those obstacles. I generally try not to completely start over if at all possible, and this is one of those examples. And in fact, I went in and added more spiced marmalade to really darken that more, and it looks so much better. And I felt like I needed a little bit more of the peacock feathers, so I went ahead and added more of that as well. Now, when I'm done with this, I cleaned my stamp really well, inked it up with a clear embossing ink, and stamped it again right on top of that pigment ink. The pigment ink might have held the clear embossing powder well enough on its own, but I was afraid it might not, so I stamped it with the clear embossing powder on top, sprinkled on, or embossing ink, I'm sorry, then sprinkled on clear embossing powder, and that is going to set the ink, and it's going to also give it a little bit of a sheen and a shine. You can see that as the clear embossing powder is heated, and it's going to finish off the card beautifully and make that sentiment perfect. Gives it a little bit of a shine, like I said, and it also sets it so I don't have to worry about it smearing. Then I'm going to stamp a little phrase from the same Creativity as Contagious stamp set on some smooth white cardstock using a black ink. This is the VersaFine ONYX black ink. It stamps beautiful, bold black, perfect every time. Use my guillotine trimmer to trim that into a thin strip, and we're going to pop that underneath the greeting. But before we do that, I do want to add a little bit of interest to my background. One of my favorite techniques, and I've shared it quite a few times recently, but I wanted to share it with a different die this time, is to kind of highlight the center panel or portion of the card by creating an inlay frame. Mama Elephant has this dotted detail die collection that I absolutely love. It creates this really thin frame that has dotted detail to it. And I'm going to use that to die cut a thin frame from our background. In fact, I'm just going to remove this and I'm going to discard it. But it's really teeny tiny. Then we're going to use that die again and die cut this from white cardstock. And very carefully remove that from the die. It sticks a little bit because it does die cut a dotted design. And hopefully in the final photos, you can see that little dotted detail there. And then we'll inlay this frame into the background, and it really highlights the sentiment perfectly. My favorite way to adhere this is to apply a nice strong adhesive all over the front of a card. Just make it nice and strong, and then take the outer frame. I like to start with the outer and work my way in. So then we'll take the thin frame that we've just die cut and inlay that right next to that outer background frame and finish with the inside panel. I like to work slowly. Just make sure it gets lined up. That adhesive is super strong, so it's really hard to move if you don't get it where it's supposed to go the first time. And then we will inlay the center panel. And that little thin frame just really highlights the beauty of the inside of this frame. And I'm just making sure everything's lined up perfectly down there. So pretty and so easy to create. Creates a fantastic little highlight there. Next, I'm going to take some foam adhesive and place that on the back of my sentiment little phrase strip here. Remove the backing paper and pop that up down below to finish off the sentiment and greeting for my card. And the final thing we're going to do is add some detail to the entire card with some Nuvo crystal drops. And what I want to do is create these to mimic the rainbow order on my card. And it's not going to be all over, but it's mostly going to follow some of the swirls and the design of the sentiment itself, just creating little dots that go around. So this is the purple Nuvo crystal drops that I'm using first. This is the crushed grape. We'll move down into carnation pink, kind of where those colors transition from purple to pink. and little tiny drops. I like to have a scrap piece of paper next to me in order to squeeze out a little bit before I get started. Sometimes a lot. If it's really goopy, some of them work better than others, I've found. But I often find if you squeeze out a little bit on a scrap piece of paper, it will flow a little bit better. And like I said, some are better than others. Ripened pumpkin is the orange color I'm using. And just a few little dots here and there. I'm going to switch back to my carnation pink. I like to mix it up, and I like the little dot detail as it comes around. It just adds a fun little bit of embellishment and interest to this background. Dandelion yellow is the yellow color that I'm going to use here. The yellow pretty sparingly. The yellow does not show up as well as some of the other colors. It's going to be more texture than anything. Just kind of like trying to stamp the sentiment with the squeezed lemonade over the squeezed lemonade and spice marmalade background. Not going to show up that great. Next, we've got our green, which is green apple, or apple green, I guess it's called. And the final color is Caribbean Ocean. And those colors, like I said, really mimic the look and feel, or the look and the colors of the distress inks we used for the background. And we're going to finish off with these. You want to give your Nuvo crystal drops a good 24 hours to completely dry. I will tell you though, with such teeny tiny drops like these, I don't think it probably takes as long. They dry really, really quick. With the bigger ones, you definitely want to give it that 24 hours. And probably, I'm sure they recommend that. But for these, I don't give it quite that long. That's going to finish off my rainbow stenciled background and stamped greeting card. Thank you so much for joining me today for this card featuring Mama Elephant stamps and dies. The supplies I used to create my card are listed and linked below the video here on YouTube. Here are a couple more videos featuring Mama Elephant that you might be interested in. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.